up and up and up. I have no part in that. Money ain't coming to me. Let's see if we can get some clearage on here. That'll work. Okay. I always like to start off with an analogy, something that we can use in our real world to try to give some meaning to what we're talking about here. So have an open mind. We're going to look at this photo on the screen, and we're going to use layman's terms. We're going to say this person is running to our right. Now, the running to the right, we don't stop and smell the roses, as my mom used to say, but think about it, the movement, not talking about joints, but the movement is really relative between him and the road. It's between those two things. If he didn't have the road, he wouldn't be going anywhere. Think of it like this, it's hard to run on ice, right? I think the surface you're running on matters. It's part of what's allowing you to, sometimes on the basketball court, it's dusty. What do? You try to get the off your shoes to get better grip, right? It's really about you in the court, you in the field. When it's raining and muddy, you're not going to run the same as you are on artificial turf. It's a relationship between you and the road. I can do the exact same movements as this gentleman here, but if my feet are in contact with the ground, I'm not going to go anywhere. Okay? So let's look at it a different way. He's running to our right. What if we looked at a treadmill runner and we asked the same question? How is the treadmill runner running? Ooh, too close. Now, the treadmill technically is moving to our left. That's actually where the movement's going, right? But we wouldn't say he's running to the left. He's kind of running in the same direction as the runner that was on the road. It's another example of how you can have motion in two different global directions, but the actual motion from a relative perspective is the exact same. This dude is still running to our right, even though the road is shifting to the left. They're running in the same direction. If all of a sudden the treadmill would stop, he would go this way, right? He's running in the same way. So a lot of times these motions get confusing because our brains want to credit what we see most of the time as what's happening all of the time. Example, from here to there is right wrist extension from anatomical. But also from here to there is right wrist extension from anatomical. It got me to the exact same place, even though you may see the hand move counterclockwise to here, but this one went clockwise. But it got me to the same place. It got me to the exact same place, so it had to be the same movement. It had to be the same motion. Yes? Cool? All right. Let us continue on our journey. One of the, I think, most important concepts to understand, and that's why we practice, that's why we develop. Position, where are you at, is reference to anatomical. Students get this confused all the time. The motion, where are you going, in terms of your first exam, sagittal plane, is reference to fetal. I mentioned it last week, but I just introduced it to you. Now I need to develop, and I'm going to give you examples of why and how. But I'll say it one more time. Position, where are you at, is reference to anatomical position. However, motion, where are you going, in our sagittal plane first exam is going to be referenced off of fetal position. Let me explain why, or a couple reasons why. So looking on your unit book, this modified picture, if we said extension is going, or let's say some flawed logic from students in the past, it's not their fault. I needed to do a better job of teaching them. They say flexion gets you away from anatomical and extension gets you to anatomical. Sometimes that's a common misconception. And so what I'll do is I'll say that can happen. Flexion took me away from anatomical and extension took me back. But what happens if I do this? Didn't extension take me from anatomical? And didn't flexion take me back? So it can't be a rule that flexion always takes you away from anatomical and extension always takes you back. But you know what flexion always does? Get me closer to fetal, into a ball, my wrist being into a ball. And you know what extension does? It gets me further away from that ball. No matter whether I'm going to anatomical, I got further away from fetal. Whether I went extension from anatomical, I got further away from fetal. I got to travel 180 degrees to get back there. But position is based off of anatomical. We have anatomical position. I'm in a flexed position, or I'm in an extended position. Reference to anatomical. Does that make sense? You see the difference? Okay. Let's try to use another analogy. Y'all like the analogies? They're working? Okay. All right. On the test, you guys are going to be accountable for these joints that have specific things in common. Because this first test is us practicing the verbiage, practicing the language. It's like a thing Rosetta Stone, and we're learning a new language. And we're learning, it's not just about learning words, it's about putting those words together to form useful sentences that we can communicate with each other. Right? The cervical vertebra gets us in the fetal, gets us out of fetal. So therefore we have flexion and extension in the cervical vertebra sagittal plane. Our trunk gets us in the fetal and away from fetal, flexion and extension in the sagittal plane. Our shoulders, remember ESPN, they've been lying to you all these years, get you more in the fetal or less in the fetal. And remember, this is flexion, because if you were going to get into a ball, you would do this, not this. Heads up, look out. Okay? The shoulder, the elbow, and the fetal out of fetal, flexion, extension. But remember, it can also look something like this. I got more in the fetal. I got less in the fetal. Okay? The wrist, the hip follows the same rules as the shoulder and the knee. That's what you're accountable for. Now, what I'm going to do right now is explain how, remember, anatomical position and your center of mass, like your center of mass is almost like the capital of your body, but you have different cities. You have different cities all over. You have different players, the analogy I use. And those players work together to help the team run plays and do certain things, functional tasks of side and reach. However, every city, every player doesn't all, home base isn't Lafayette, Louisiana for all. That's what I'm trying to say. And I'll give you some analogies on what in the world I'm talking about. So let's look at a map of a road that we're familiar with, Interstate 10, okay? Interstate 10 runs from Florida all the way to California, and we happen to be on I-10. Some of our joints their home is like Lafayette, meaning I can travel east or I can travel west on the interstate. Some of our joints, and I'm going to go through them, it's going to make a lot of sense, honestly. Some of our joints, their anatomical position is like Jacksonville, Florida, meaning they're all the way at the end of the interstate. The only place they can travel is west. They can't go any further east because they're already east. Remember references. Is Lafayette east or west? Well, it has to be relative to another city or another place. But Jacksonville, you can't go any further east on I-10. So it's okay for us to say Jacksonville is east, because there's nothing else we can compare it to. Analogy of the human body. The wrist is like living in Lafayette. I could travel in a direction of flexion from anatomical, or I could travel in a direction of extension from anatomical. But the elbow is like Jacksonville, Florida. I can't extend from anatomical because I'm all the way at the end of my road. There's a bony end plate right there. End point, they call it. So we can say things like, and I'm going to explain where the confusion comes from. Let me try to get in the view of the camera. We can say things like, for the elbow, anatomical position is an extended position. But we can only do that for a joint like the elbow, where you're all the way at the end of the road. The only thing you can do is flex. Or if you get into an injury, hyperextend beyond normal extension, right? Does that make sense? But I think what happens is that because you guys have been introduced to things with common use joints like elbows and knees that happen to be in Jacksonville, Florida, we think, well, then all joints must follow that same rule. When here I am extended, this must be flexion, this must be extension, just like the elbow, and so this must be hyper. That's normal range of motion. There's nothing hyper about this. Hyper would be like, you see where a lot of these confusions come from, okay? So one at a time, let's go through for communication. Let's go through our joints. Your cervical vertebra, Lafayette, Louisiana. Anatomical position, I can flex from anatomical and I can extend from anatomical. No problem. And if I go beyond either, hyperflexion, hyperextension, beyond normal. So what does that mean? That means from anatomical, I can have flexion from anatomical. I can have extension to anatomical. I can have extension from anatomical, and I can have flexion to anatomical. And if you wanted to be specific, just like you do on a road, instead of mile markers, we do degrees. I have limited motion or I have pain when I flex 10 degrees from anatomical position. We have to make it relative so that we know where you are on the road. Cervical flexion from, cervical extension to, cervical extension from, cervical flexion to. And what happens if you do a full range of motion? No problem. If you started east of Lafayette and you were traveling west and you forgot to exit, wouldn't you just pass through home? Right? You're traveling west to Lafayette, you pass it up, you're traveling west from Lafayette. Cervical flexion to, cervical flexion from, I just pass through anatomical. It's like crossing into another state where the mile markers get less and less. 4, 3, 2, 1, Mississippi. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You're traveling the same direction, huh? So you could be like 10, 5, 0, 5, 10, 15, 20. That's the same concept. Okay. Trunk, same thing. Lafayette. I can flex from, but I could also extend from. My trunk in anatomical isn't in an extended position because I can travel with normal range of motion in both directions. Doing a crunch, flexion from, going back down, extension to. Doing a downward dog, extension from, coming back down, flexion to. Twos and fros. Shoulder, Lafayette, Louisiana. I'm going both directions. I'm not extended in anatomical. Why? Because I can travel this way. That's normal range of motion for me, for all of it. So the shoulder is like Lafayette, Louisiana, where I can go on either road in either direction, not either road, same road, either direction. I can have shoulder flexion from anatomical. I could have a shoulder extension to anatomical, but I could also have shoulder extension from anatomical, and I could have shoulder extension to it. In fact, when allied health professionals do range of motion, usually they'll check it from anatomical, and they'll say, okay, this many degrees from, they'll bring it back, and then they'll go the other way and say that many degrees from, and then when they want to get a full range of motion, they add. That's all it is. Twos and froms. Elbow, Jacksonville, Florida. The elbow lives all the way, its home is all the way east of I-10, so the only way it can travel is west, in and out. My elbow can't extend from anatomical because it's already at the end of its road. So that's why, and I really think this is why there's so much confusion, because we can say that the elbow is extended, but I think a lot of times we just assume, well, if the elbow could do it, anything else can do it too. Shoulders extended in anatomical, wrists is extended in anatomical. It's like, no. That's the reason you can do that for the elbow is because it's at the end of the road versus the others that are not. Does that make sense? Yes, ma'am.
So anatomical, would be like most extended.
Yeah, or in your knee. Yeah, and we have a couple other joints when we get into the specificity, like the radial ulnar joint is supinated in anatomical, meaning I keep going further. The only way I can travel down that road is pronation. And I'm going to teach you, I just think this is cool, not going to be on your test, but have you ever heard of a semi-pronated position? That's because the only way to get there is to pronate. If anatomical was here, this would be called a semi-supinated position. Like, it's those kind of workish things that I'm trying to make it make sense for us so that we don't just play fast and loose with position and motion. Great clarification question. I encourage more. So your elbow and, well, I'll get to the knee when we get to the knee. But your elbow is in anatomical position. It is extended. But there's a reason why. And I explain the reasons. Does that make sense? Okay. Hyper, excessive, beyond normal. It's like, silly, but like if the end of I-10 is right there and you just like smash through it and go past it, probably going to cause some damage. Same thing with normal range of hyperextended. Not a good day. Right? Wrist, Lafayette. Wrist is Lafayette because we can flex from anatomical and we can extend from anatomical. That's normal range of motion. I could go east or I could go west. Cool. So that example is in the unit, but practicing verbiage, it's all about practice. Left wrist flexion from, left wrist extension to, left wrist extension from, left wrist flexion to. If I did a full range of motion, left wrist flexion to, left wrist flexion from. And do you know what to and from means? Anatomical. To home, away from home. To home, away from home. Just like you'd be traveling on the interstate. Yes? Okay. Hip. Lafayette, Louisiana. Left hip flexion from, left hip extension to, left hip extension from, left hip flexion to, left hip flexion from anatomical, left hip extension to anatomical, left hip extension from anatomical, left hip flexion to anatomical. Knee, Jacksonville, Florida. When your knee is in anatomical position, the thought of doing this doesn't gives you what we call the flissons where I'm from, right? The chicken, the goosebumps. You don't want your knee to do this from anatomical. So that's why we would have a term like hyperextension. And hyper is a relative term. My youngest son, when he stands up, he looks like an ostrich, like his legs are like this, but for him that's normal. So I'm not saying that, like, there's layers to this, but for the first test, we're gonna look at normal range of motion and position, not exceptions. I'm not gonna put a contortionist on your test. Make sense? And also, very important to know on your test, I will never, ever ask you to identify motion like this. No way. It's always gonna be obvious. It's never going to be like, okay, guys, what happened to my shoulder? No. I'm not trying to get you. I'm just trying to see if you could speak this language without playing fast and loose with verbiage. That's all it is. Okay? The knee, oh yeah, just did the knee. Okay, so the knee is in an extended position in anatomical because it can't go any further. Jacksonville. Cool? Okay. All right. What does flexion kind of review? What does flexion mean? Yes, absolutely. It's the row of the field. Absolutely. Flexion is motion that gets you in the fetal position. And remember, fetal position doesn't have to be all or none. It doesn't have to be your whole body or not your body. My wrist can get into fetal position of my wrist. My wrist is in fetal. My fingers are in fetal. My elbow is in fetal. My shoulder is in fetal. And I think that's what tricks ESPN, bless their hearts, they don't know any better, that they're looking at shoulder position and motion, but they're actually looking at the elbow. The elbow's fully extended. I got no problem with that, but the elbow was extended when you were down here. So what's so special about that? I could understand if like the outfielder was like running like this, fully extended. I get that. But that's the elegance of this class, is I'm going to teach you not to look at the distractions and see where things are happening. Okay? All right, let's do some practice. When I do practice, you are more than welcome to use your own phones. In fact, I think Sarah and suggested before and afters, or hey, can you do that again? And I'll make sure I get the different examples, okay? So this is interactive, right? So we're gonna play a game called position and motion, or motion. Listen to the different types of questions. If I'm asking you about position, don't get tempted to say motion. If I'm asking you about motion, tell me motion, okay? What is the position of both of my wrists? That does not mean they are the same. We analyze motion joint by joint. Just because my left side's doing something doesn't mean my right has to do the same, okay? So how we would communicate that is you would say, well, the right wrist is in this position and the left wrist is in the same position, or the left wrist is in a different position. We just never want to assume, okay? First question, what is the position of my wrists? Don't answer it right away. Don't answer it right away. Not that you don't have an answer, I just want everyone to have time to process it at the speed at which they process. And at the end of the day, we just want right answers. So here's the question. I want you to identify the position of both of my wrist joints. Where are they at relative to what? Fetal or anatomical? Position is relative to anatomical. Motion, but that's why we practice. That's why we practice. I'd much rather miss one in class when it doesn't cost me anything and then get it right on the test. Right? It's like making a mistake during practice so that in the game, you don't make that same mistake. Okay? Identify the position of both of my wrists. My left wrist is flexed and my right wrist is flexed. Okay? Now we're going to play identify the motion of my wrists. I start here. If you want to take a picture of my starting position, you're more than welcome to, because my forearm's about to cramp. I'm joking. Start, finish. Start position, finish position. What did you observe? If I start here and I do this, on the test, you won't literally see this, but we can infer it, because if I start here and the next picture is me being here, I have to move down this road to get there. Okay? Start, finish. Give that some thought. Oh, let me go to the screen. Start, finish. Unlike the Bills field goal kicker. Sorry, Bills fan. I'm not a Chiefs fan. I don't care. I like drama. Okay. The way we would communicate this on our test is, if the left side did something different than the right, we would say, well, the left side did this and the right side did that. But if they both did the same thing, we could take a shortcut and we could say both sides, bilateral, just like the bilateral axis traveled through both sides. Now, it's not wrong to say left and right did the same thing. Nothing wrong with that at all. But we can also use the term bilateral. Yes. So the wrist had bilateral wrist extension. And if we wanted to get more specific, we could say bilateral wrist extension to anatomical position. They went home. The key thing is that you guys understand from last week's lecture that just because both hands look like they were traveling different spins, they were doing the exact same thing. Just like double doors, both open when they spin different ways. Both wrists are in a fetal position. Follow the fingers. The fingers show you flexion. They're both in a fetal, and now they're both not. So how did you get from being in a fetal to not being in a fetal? You had to have extension. You had that extension to go further away from fetal. Yes? Okay. Does it get harder? Of course it does. Well, we got to start somewhere. We got to practice somewhere. Okay. Yes, sir.
On the test, you have your wrist like this. Would you get say that you're in view, or that you have to stay there for
It depends on the question, right? So if the question was, what is the position of the wrist? And I might say anatomical, extended, flexed. Like which one of those is correct? Flexed. So it depends on the question. It depends on the question. But the question will be very clear based off of elimination of choices, which one has it, right? But you know what we don't want to say? We don't want to say flexion. We don't want to say that at all. Especially, maybe I wouldn't give you one of those if we're in the range of motion. I would totally give you one if we're like halfway. Because again, if someone's like, this is flexion, and I'm like, really? How is it moving? It's flexed. But what if I took a high resolution photo of me going up, right? Like I could have been extending while that snapshot was being taken. Does that make sense? Okay, guys, next question. Start here. Ready? Start. Finish. Start. Finish. Start. Finish. Start. Finish. Sometimes I shake up the Etch-a-Sketch to start again because I don't want someone to misunderstand where I'm going. Start. Finish. Layman's terms, just to make sure we're understanding what's happening. My left hand went up and my right hand went down. That has nothing to do with joint motions. But in terms of making sure you got which one did what, I'll use those terms for now. Okay?
What joint are we looking at?
That is a great question. And what we're going to eventually have to do is see it. So in other words, did my wrist move? Can you see? Can you see the wrist? So no for the wrist. The elbow didn't do anything. My ankles did, I wouldn't ask for it. My knees didn't do anything. My hips didn't do anything. My trunk didn't. So it's almost like we're going to have to learn how to see what is moving. In fact, a good start, it's my fault. A good start could have been identify which joint has motion. And I could have been like, what's this? What's this? What's this? What's this? So we might do that on Wednesday. But it's your shoulder, because the shoulder is the only thing, but that's something we're gonna have to work to be able to identify.
It's
Yep.
not gonna be tricky, like, I'm thinking about other, maybe two
Bring it.
questions or
This is great.
something where it's like,
No, I think I know, tell me if I'm fishing in your same pond. If I did something like this, right? Well,
which piece?
yeah, exactly, and the question will say that.
Okay.
So it'll say, identify the motion, because remember, I'm trying to eventually teach you how to not fall for distractions. So I might do something like this, like, and say, what happened at my right hip? And so this doesn't matter, it's what happened here. So that'll always be communicated either on the question, or if I don't tell you, that means there was only one thing that happened, that there didn't need to be a sorting of, because there was only one thing.
Okay.
Outstanding clarification question. No, thank you. I guarantee you some other people had the same question. All right, guys. Did both shoulders do the same thing? Good. Which shoulder, I'm asking different questions to show you how we get to different answers. Which shoulder, did they both start out in the same position? Yes. What position is that? Flexed. Both shoulders are flexed. Relative to anatomical, both shoulders are close to the fetal position, right? But they didn't stay in the same position. One went back home. So the left shoulder had to have extension, left shoulder extension. It went back home. It went from being in a flexed position to going closer to anatomical, so you have to travel down the specific direction of extension to get there. This shoulder went from being in a flexed position of about 90 degrees to being in a more flexed position. It went closer to fetal, so that meant it had to have flexion to get more in the fetal. Make sense? Left shoulder extension, right shoulder flexion. Cool? All right, let's do an illusion. Love these illusions. Then on Wednesday, we'll start on bones. Okay, where's my Kindle? Right shoulder flexion. Right shoulder flexion. Yes? If I understand from here, it's just like running on the treadmill and running on regular ground. It may look different, but you get to the same place. So here's my question to you. Oh, for the video. I did this is the same thing as this. Same place. Okay? I drop Ken, want to pick him up. So I'm going to do this. The reason I put my hand on my left hip is to try to show you potential changes in angles. Okay? Do it again. Man, I'm rough again. Sorry. I'm going to do it in a different way. Same thing, but I'm going to do it from a different view. Open-ended question. What did you observe when I went down to get Ken and then when I came up to get Ken? Only significant motions. I'm not talking about, you plantar flex 1 degree or you're old and you were shaking. So like I'm talking about obvious motion, significant motion. Open-ended question. You're analyzing human movement. What did you see? Going down, and then when I came up. Also, I cannot encourage this enough. Think about it on your own, and then ask your neighbor, what did you get? Have a conversation with someone. If y'all both getting the same thing, that's great. But you know what else is great? If y'all are not getting the same thing, that's great, because then you can have a conversation of why you think it's what you think. And maybe they change your mind. Maybe you change their mind. But that's how true learning happens, okay? Does everybody understand the question? We understand the assignment? What did you observe significantly when I went down? And what did you observe significantly when I came up? Go. Give it some thought. Let me make sure that so this is for the camera, for people watching. So Ken is on the ground. He's right here. And I did this. And then I came back up. And the question is, what did you observe with significant motion to help me get down to get Ken and coming back up to get Ken? That's the question. And you can pause it. You can pause the video, give it some thought, come up with an answer, and then unpause it when you're ready to hear the answer. All right. Does anybody need more time? We're good? Okay. We analyze motion joint by joint. So before we get into a motion, let's practice identifying a joint that had significant motion. Someone tell me a specific joint that had significant motion in it. What we got? Y'all can say it too. Okay. Hip, right shoulder, right hip. Outstanding. The right hip had motion. The right shoulder had motion. Outstanding. What didn't have motion was my left hip, right? It might look like it's moving, but I could literally be in a cast and could do this. I could be in a cast and rotate on my right side and make my leg go out. Because flexion, extension, abduction, none of that technically matters when you just see a certain bone move a certain way. It's the relative change about the runner and the road or the runner and the treadmill. That's how you know you're running. Okay? So hip, shoulder, let's start low. We'll start ground up. The right hip absolutely had motion. What motion did my right hip have when I went down? Flexion, outstanding. Right hip flexion. And when I came back up? All day and on holidays and weekends. Right hip flexion when I went down. Right hip extension when I came up. That's like saying I started in Lafayette, I traveled east, and then I turned around and I came west and I ended back where I started. Two illusions here. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. If all you've ever done is memorized, extension is when the leg goes out, we have a problem. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm just saying it doesn't have to happen. And if all you've ever done is memorize that, you're going to miss movement when you're analyzing people. Happens all the time. So as professionals who actually have an education in this stuff, it's my job to make you different than the people who practice human movement who don't. Giving you your money's worth, okay? Any questions about why the right hip had flexion on the way down? Because this position, guys, and I'm getting old, all right, so I need some grace. This position is the exact same as this position. Same thing, from my right hip's perspective. Running on the ground, running on the treadmill, same direction. One direction. Joking, never use that joke again. All right, let's talk shoulders. Did my right shoulder have motion? Absolutely. Can you see how some people who are not trained in human movement would say, no, it didn't move, because they've only been introduced to shoulder motion like this. Arm go back, arm go front. My arm didn't swing anyway. It stayed in the same global position, but I sure as heck had shoulder motion. If I didn't have shoulder motion, guys, this is what it would have looked like. Stayed in anatomical position. Do you see it? I had to have shoulder motion, specifically flexion. Running on the ground. Running on the treadmill. Running on the ground. Running on the treadmill. The socket is moving about the ball. That's okay. So what do we have? We have right shoulder flexion on my way down, and we had right shoulder extension on the way up. How do I know I'm in a flex position? I started out pretty anatomically. This is where I ended. Freeze, Rick. This is where I'm at. Those are my shoulders. My shoulders like, dude, I'm more in fetal. Like 90 degrees worth. Cool. To me, that's the biggest illusion we got to retrain your brains to see. Because y'all are so used to seeing motion like we're used to seeing. How often do you see someone move on a treadmill relative to move on the ground, right? Not as common. But I promise you, in human motion, we do a lot of moving on the treadmill. The distal parts stay fixed, and we move the proximals about the distals a lot. Okay. Any questions? Was today productive? The key thing, in my opinion, to not miss a bunch of test questions, position, where are you at? Motion, where are you going? How are you moving? Position is reference to anatomical. I am either in anatomical position, I'm in flexed, or I'm extended. For the first test, we have others coming. Motion is based off of sagittal plane fetal. Am I traveling to fetal, or am I traveling away from fetal? Fetal motion is flexion, extension motion, away from fetal. All right, guys, y'all have a good one. Practice, 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 practice. Practice.